For coming out on short notice today to talk about the economy. I think it's gone from being one of the issues that people think about from time to time to being the absolute center stage. It's hard to remember a point in time where there has been more concern about the direction that our economy is headed, or in attempting to think of solutions that will prevent the worst from happening. I think we're very lucky today to have two distinguished guests to help us discuss this and take apart the issues. We're going to start off with Ellen Hughes Cromwick, who is the chief economist for Ford Motor Company. That's not just for here in the United States, but worldwide. She's got her eye on economies all the way around the world. And she is also not only the chief economist for Ford Motor Company, but she's president of the National Association for Business Economists right now. So she really represents, I think, a perspective that she has a perspective that represents a broad base of the business community in the United States and the view of what's happening with the economy. Also with us today is Jim Horney. Jim is an old friend of mine. He's part of a group of budgeteers. We get together and have conversations that no one else in the world could understand and take pride on it. But Jim was he worked for the budget committees in both the House and Senate, and he was with the Congressional Budget Office and a chief analyst there. He's now with the Center on Budget Priorities, Budget and Policy Priorities, as their chief fiscal affairs person. So we're going to start off with Ellen, and then Jim, and then I will make a presentation. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much. Welcome this morning. I appreciate the invitation to talk to you a bit about the fiscal stimulus prospects in the package. And what I'd like to do is first start with a quick summary of the economic outlook. I think that might set the stage for some comments with regard to what a package might look like and what are some of the principles around that type of package. So if I could go to the first slide. And we're out there in the battleground, so to speak, of the economy, being at one of the sectors that has been most severely affected by the financial crisis. We do expect this downturn to continue through the first half of this year. In our current forecast for the U.S., we have a peak to trough decline in real GDP of about 3% now. That would make it one of the most severe economic downturns in the post-World War II period. We saw specifically across the board, not just in autos, but in other important sectors, a severe contraction that began to accelerate as the financial crisis persisted into the third quarter of 2008. And I'll give you one statistic to highlight that. After the Lehman Brothers failure in September, vehicle sales fell at an annual rate by 2 million units in 1 month from September to October. For total sales, we went from 12.9 million units to 10.9 million units in just 1 month. And we have a proprietary database that goes back to the 40s and 50s. And it's very rare to see such a marked decline in selling rates for vehicles. Given the size of our vehicle stock out there, you might be aware it's about 245 million units on the road. So that does portray what we saw, which was this beginning stage of a so-called negative feedback loop. As you can see here on the second bullet, new vehicle sales then for the second half of last year fell at an annual rate of 45%. that was the most pronounced drop-off since mid-1980. And the reason that's important is because in mid-1980, for those of you who are good students of policy, that was a period when Congress had enacted consumer credit controls. And they were put in place for a period of about 3 months and a few days, finally repealed in early July of 1980. And, of course, they were designed with good intentions from the standpoint of, wanting to begin to arrest the very high double-digit inflation environment that had resulted from the policies put in place in the latter part of the 1970s. So this is the most severe since that credit shock, which again indicates the extent to which this economy has been very severely affected by the credit crisis. In terms of the near-term forecast, we think there's the most pronounced weakness expected in the first half of this year. And of course, you probably saw the job numbers this morning. It does very clearly indicate the need for timely and significant fiscal stimulus. We lost over 500,000 jobs in the month of December. We had downward revisions to job losses in the 2 prior months. The unemployment rate is now at 7.2%. I wanted to hit the core issue here as it relates to the financial crisis, because as you well know, it's been well discussed among experts. The housing situation is really at the core of the problem that is being faced by consumers. Home prices are down 18% over a year ago. We've got very high housing inventories, as you can see in the top right panel. We're now looking at new home stocks that are equivalent to over 13 months of supply at current selling rates. So we've got excess stocks, both new and existing homes, well above the long-run averages, which you can see in the box there for new. Long-run average is roughly 6 months of supply at current selling rates. Existing is about 7. So we're well in excess of what would be considered normal stocks. That suggests quite clearly that we'll have continued downward pressure on home prices unless we begin to really tackle this issue. On the bottom left panel, you can see how the current housing downturn compares to prior downturns in home building activity. The solid line is new home starts, and this is an index. So what I've done in the solid line is show the peak in housing starts, which occurred in January of 2006. So I've indexed that to 100, and then essentially this is tracking housing starts since that peak in January of 06, and the other lines showing an average of the pre-1980 downturns as well as the 1981 downturn specifically. Those are also indexed at their respective peaks. Bottom line, you can see that this home building activity decline, in fact, is still going down at a fairly rapid rate. And that is something that has to be addressed very quickly. On the bottom right, you can see the relationship between autos and home sales. And the point I want to make with this slide, you've probably seen some analysts out there saying, well, housing and autos really was in a boom just like housing. And in point of fact, no. In this decade, we saw essentially a very low correlation between housing and autos, unlike the historical data where there was a very high correlation between housing and autos. As you can see, autos was fairly stable over the course of this decade. And in fact, vehicle sales peaked, believe it or not, in the year 2000. So this era of cheap credit that was generated by substantial financial innovation in this decade was not an advantage to the automotive sector. Our sales pace, as you can see, was relatively flat. So with that introduction, let me just comment a bit about some of the key principles behind a stimulus package. I think I've pretty much indicated to you, I do believe we need a sizable stimulus package. It should be enacted quickly, and it should be targeted to stimulate demand and to stabilize the situation with respect to the housing sector. What is really important is that we have to somehow break this negative feedback loop between the financial situation and the economy. At the core, as I mentioned, is the housing sector. That's really fueled these negative effects across the consumer terrain, including autos. And I also want to point out that I do global economics, and what we saw in the data was this pronounced syncing up of the global economy as the financial crisis persisted and was particularly exacerbated by the Lehman failure. At that point, we saw consumer spending in all of the major markets begin to fall precipitously. And, I just close out this slide by suggesting that the role of fiscal policy during these periods of extreme duress is to truncate those declines in confidence, which feed on themselves, both consumer and business, stabilize the negative cyclical momentum brought on by the credit shock, and then act quickly and decisively, as I've mentioned. So we need provisions that really pack a punch. They should be direct and also, balanced from the standpoint of both tax cuts and spending, that have a clear exit strategy. I think the measures have to be directed at both consumers and businesses and focus on stabilizing the labor market, making sure that we're addressing the existing jobs out there. We don't want folks having to lose their jobs at a rate that we have just seen in the last 4 to 5 months. We need to begin to stabilize and keep people in their jobs and focus on also creating new jobs. And again, to reiterate, housing relief is critical, and we have to cut that feedback loop. So just quickly to recap, I know I'm hitting the high-level points, but very important to indicate that we need massive fiscal stimulus. It is appropriate and critical at this juncture, given the way that the credit shock has spread out to affect most sectors of the economy. It needs to be designed to provide efficient relief, and by that I mean relief that doesn't really focus on lower productivity activities. Housing component is critical, and again, balance from the standpoint of tax cuts and spending provisions. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you. I don't have any PowerPoint presentation, but we're in a really fascinating time. I've been involved in the budget issues in Washington since the early 80s, and what's going on right now is different in a number of important ways from what's happened in the past. Obviously, in the past, when the economy appears to be slowing, when unemployment starts rising, there's a lot of concern about what can we do. Congress, the president want to be seen as taking action to do something to stem this problem. But in all of the previous occasions when this has happened and there's been a discussion about a fiscal stimulus package, there have been huge debates about whether it would be an appropriate thing to do. In part, this stemmed from the fact that on average, in post-World War II recessions, the recessions have been relatively brief and not too terribly deep, although obviously the early 80s turned out to be a pretty severe recession. But we've often been in a situation where it turned out afterwards that we were already on the rebound before you even knew you were in the recession. And so people have argued when things start slowing down, they say, well, you got to be careful because you don't want to jump out there and do something when in fact it's going to be too late and you're going to overheat the economy, you're going to do too much. Also, general feeling that I think among the economics profession that it was better off to leave it to the Fed to take care of downturns. Let the Fed deal with monetary policy and get us out of this, that fiscal relief not only is unnecessary, that it takes too long to get it enacted, it usually isn't targeted right, and it's unnecessary, so why take the chance that you're going to do something that's costly and at the end of the day may not have been needed at all. We're in a really different situation this time. I think it's striking the consensus among a wide range of economists about we are in a very serious situation. We now are in a recession for a year. I think that most forecasters agree that it's unlikely that we're going to really start growing before the sort of later in 2009. Some are more pessimistic that it would be even later, but this is likely to be very extended. And I think there probably is a general agreement that even when we do start growing out of this, it's not going to be at as rapid a pace as it has been in the past, partly because of credit problems, the housing situation, a number of other things. I think Congressional Budget Office forecast the other day basically said they think in the latter half of 2009 we will start to rebound, but that the growth will be a good deal slower than what we've typically seen in the early stages of recoveries in the past. So general consensus, we're facing a downturn here that's likely to be quite deep, with a bigger GDP gap than we've seen in general, unemployment that could be reaching close to the levels that we saw in the early 80s. And the other thing, of course, is that feeling now is there isn't a lot more that the Fed can do, that the Fed has lowered interest rates, that for a variety of reasons that hasn't taken care of the problem and be hard to do more. So the first time in my career in Washington, there is a widespread, not unanimous, but very widespread agreement that we do in fact need a very substantial fiscal stimulus package. And it's striking that as many people as are agreeing that something in the range of $800 billion that it appears that President-elect Obama will propose is appropriate. Many people think it should be more. There certainly are people who say that's too much. But the fact that we're even talking about maybe coalescing around something in the range of $800 billion over a couple of years is very striking in comparison with what we've seen in the past. Now, the problem, of course, is because of the history of fiscal stimulus since World War II, we don't have experience with putting together a package anywhere near that size. This just hasn't been something that serious people have thought was a real possibility in the past, and so stimulus packages in the past have been much smaller. It was easier to say, here are the kinds of things in a package of that size that you can do that would be a good idea. Those aren't always the things that got included in the stimulus package, but I think analysts could at least say, here, you can do this much. We know this could get out, stimulate the economy, and do some good. But when you start talking about $800 billion, it starts getting a little bit hard. So, or bigger than that. And I think there's some reason to believe that people in the Obama transition believe that we could usefully do more stimulus than around $775 billion, $800 billion. And then in addition to the political constraints that you might run into, they may be believing there are actually constraints about designing a package that's bigger than that you could put into things that really would be useful. Focus a minute on what I think would be useful and what I think we need to keep our eye on as we move forward. And I agree completely with Ellen. What we need to do is stimulate demand. This is the case. There are also problems in the credit markets. Treasury needs to do everything it can to stabilize credit markets. Try to make sure that companies that do want to hold on to employees and invest in new equipment and plant and so on have access to money to do that. But the most important thing is that companies have demand for their products, so that they want to keep their employees, they want to make investments. And one of the things I think people need to keep their eye on is that while people are saying we need to focus on jobs in a stimulus package, that's absolutely right. That doesn't mean, though, that the policies have to be policies that are directly tied to jobs, like a jobs tax credit or something. Jobs, protecting jobs, creating jobs, the most important thing there is to create demand, so that, in fact, there is demand for the products and services that people provide, and therefore people will keep being employed. And some of the ways you can do that very effectively are, for instance, unemployment insurance. Well, some people would say, wait, these people are unemployed. How's it helping those people keep a job, to give them unemployment? Well, it doesn't directly help them keep a job. They're already unemployed. But the money that these people spend will, in fact, protect other jobs because it will keep the level of demand up. Similarly, an increase in food stamp benefits, something we've proposed, and I think is likely to be in the Obama plan, is another way of getting money there. And in particular, getting to money to people who will spend that money. If you're recently unemployed, if you're on food stamps, you're struggling to meet your day-to-day needs. If we provide additional assistance to those people, that money is going to get spent, very large portion of it, as opposed to things that go to people with much higher incomes. One huge thing, very effective, is state fiscal relief. Now, again, I think there are some people who say, well, what do you mean? Give money to the states. How does that help jobs? Well, 44 states in the United States right now are facing budget deficits either this year or next year. Fiscal years for states start in July, so this fiscal year, the one that starts next July. There are 6 states that aren't facing it. It's not because those states are, so well run and managed. It's because they depend very heavily on energy. Texas, Alaska, Montana, and so on, states that have coal or gas and oil, and depend on that for revenues, are doing okay. Although 6 months from now it may be a different story even for them. But 44 other states facing budget deficits that over the next 2.5 years total $350 billion or more. All but one of the states have a balanced budget requirement for their operating budgets. What that means is if the federal government doesn't provide some fiscal relief, doesn't provide money to these states, they are going to have to, over the next 2.5 years, either cut their spending or raise their taxes by more than $350 billion. If they cut their spending, that means they're going to be laying off teachers, firemen, so on. That means reduction in jobs. That means those people won't have their incomes. They won't be spending. It means less services, too, for the people who depend on those services, but it also means fewer jobs. Or if they raise taxes, that takes money out of the hands of people who would otherwise be spending it for consumption, buying cars, whatever. So one of the most effective things we can do is provide state fiscal relief. Some people have argued, if you give money to states, they're just going to start new programs. Look, they've got $350 billion budget hole. If we provide them $100 billion or $200 billion, they're still going to have to make cuts. They're still going to have to raise taxes. States are not going to be talking about starting or expanding programs. Even with a big infusion of fiscal relief, they're going to still be in very bad shape. So we need to keep focused on the things that have been described both by Mark Zandi at economy.com and Congressional Budget Office as having big bang for the buck. And that means money that goes out, that gets spent, that creates demand, which then creates jobs. And not get caught up in let's design some new tax cut for businesses, and some businesses may need it. You may have a company now, given the credit situation, that are credit constrained. But in general, if you give a tax credit to businesses, the business that doesn't see a demand for its products not going to spend that money. They're going to put it aside They're going to give bigger benefits or bigger dividends or so on, which would go to higher income people that are likely to save it. So instead of focusing, and there's some attempt to talk about, well, let's create a tax credit that's tied to creating new jobs. That, in theory, that's a good idea, but designing one that actually is tied to, actually is effective in identifying where new jobs are created is very difficult. So we need to keep our eye on, let's increase demand, additional infrastructure spending to the extent it can get out the door in the next couple of years. That can be very useful. I've been in the past very skeptical about infrastructure because of the length of time it takes to get out the door, but in this case we're facing a long downturn and a slow recovery. So money going out the door 18 months, 2 years from now could be very useful. So those sorts of things that get out there, create demand, and will protect jobs. And they can have some long-term benefit, like some of the infrastructure, and help people who are struggling the most. If we can combine those things, that's really desirable at this point.
Okay, Jim. I'm going to just do a fairly brief presentation because Ellen has to take a conference call with the New York Fed at 11 o'clock, and so I want to get some discussion before she has to leave us, and so I'm just going to go through very quickly. Back when the Center for American Progress was a new nascent organization, we had to rent hotel rooms in order to have conferences like this because we didn't have a conference room. And one of the first ones we did was at the Mayflower, and we had Paul Krugman, who said, "This is not your father's business cycle." I hate to use a General Motors paraphrase. This is not your father's business cycle, and that was in 2004. I think that it was apparent at that time that we had a very different economy in which the issue was not how to improve on the supply side, but whether or not we could sustain demand. And that problem, which I'm going the wrong way on my slides. Is it down? I'm just going to skip over that. We had a big demand problem. And I think it was driven primarily by, as a result of the fact that while we had significant productivity gains, we had almost no gain in wages. In other words, when workers' productivity was increased. Okay. And this, you can see what happened with worker productivity and wages from the end of World War II up until the mid-70s. The graph on your left shows it's almost exact parallel between the two. And that's what that meant was that businesses and workers were basically splitting the benefits of worker productivity. And that's very important because if you have greater productivity, you have more product, you have more things to buy, and if your workers don't have more money to spend on it, you're going to have excess inventories, and then you're going to have to start laying off. So to keep the economy in balance, you need that balance. This is what's happened since 2000. We've had a 20% growth in productivity over that period, and wages have grown by less than 1%. And employment has not kept pace with the growth in population, so family incomes are actually down. Now, the way we tried to solve that was to simply extend credit so that workers, even though they didn't have more money, had the ability to spend more. And the eventual result of that was you just dug the hole deeper, and when it came to payday, it was a pretty grim day, and that's where we are. Now, people who have looked at the shift from borrowing and spending to saving and the contraction that's taking place in the economy believe that between individuals and businesses that we're going to be spending somewhere between 9 and 10% less by the end of this year than we were spending last year. And that's a huge contraction. That's about $1.5 trillion less in spending in the economy. And the problem that is created if somebody does not step in and deal with that is that you have a downward spiral. People buy less because they're worried about the future of the economy. That means that businesses sell less and have to start laying off workers. The notices of layoffs and the type of reports that we had this morning mean that people become even more conservative about it. You have more and more financial institutions that get into trouble and are unable to loan money or are afraid to loan money to businesses. So you just have a dramatic downward spiral. And that's the kind of thing that happened in this country every so often prior to World War II and most notably in the 1930s. But it is not something that's happened since World War II. We've had 11 recessions since World War II, and really all of those recessions have been caused by the Federal Reserve deciding that the economy was becoming overheated or that inflation was going to become a problem, and so they deliberately slowed the economy. Now we have a situation in which the Fed has done everything that can be done to try to stimulate growth, and we still have a downward spiral. And that means that fiscal policy or fiscal stimulus is the only choice that we really have. I think that it's very difficult to put together a package like this, much more difficult than most people believe, because there are really constraints on how much the government can spend, and there are a lot of problems with trying to do stimulus on the tax side. By and large, it is better to do as much as you possibly can on the spending side, because that tends to recirculate inside our own economy more than tax cuts do. Most economists now say that you get about 50% more stimulus out of government spending than you do out of tax cuts. So if you want to fill that $1.5 trillion gap, you can increase the deficit less by doing it through spending than you will if you have to do it through tax cuts. Unfortunately, the federal government really can't spend the kind of money that it would take. I think that in order to close that $1.5 trillion gap, you probably can get about $400 billion to come back into the economy by having an effective plan. In other words, you don't have to have that kind of a drop if you have a government plan that is going to pump close to $1 trillion in it, and it's credible. And then businesses and individuals will start spending, and the size of the crisis will be diminished just by the fact that you have the plan. If you did it all with tax cuts, you would probably need close to $1 trillion in tax cuts. If you do it largely on spending, you probably can cut your annual outlay requirement to about $650 billion. That 650 does not compare with what the president's talking about, because he's talking about a 2-year plan, and I'm only talking about what you would need in 1 year. Of that 650 billion, probably about 400 to 450 billion would be on the spending side, and I think it will be a real challenge to see whether or not the federal government can find ways to spend money that quickly and on things that are useful. One of the biggest opportunities for that is to restore state and local budgets, because if you can prevent policemen and teachers and city administrators from being laid off, you've restored part of the workforce, and you've found a way to keep the economy running. there are a lot of things that we would like to make investments in, but some of those are quite difficult. A good deal of discussion about highways. Some people say that we have a lot of shovel-ready highways that we can, and bridges that we can start working on. CBO believes that about 32% of that would be spent in the first year of the money that we put into highways, and probably about 40% in the second year. But a substantial amount would still not be spent after 2 years. And so the money that you need to have flowing really in the months ahead, much of it won't flow for a year or two from now. And there are many areas where it is much more difficult than it is with highways to get money flowing, and particularly some of these innovative new ideas, alternative energy, those types of things. The planning and the contracting to move that type of money can take years before we can really start to see funds flowing into the economy. So I'm going to end with that and open it to questions so we get a little more chance to have a discussion with Ellen. Thank you. Right up here.
For Ellen Hughes, do you agree with Scott's point about the mixture? Do you agree with Scott's point about the mixture of spending and tax cuts that he just mentioned?
Thanks. I hope everyone heard the question. Mixture. I think that Scott makes some very good points about the efficiency of every dollar that can multiply through on the spending versus the tax side. And there are several empirical studies that do support that there's much more efficiency from the standpoint of multiplier effects for that dollar of spending if it's done properly. And don't forget that parenthetical. And I think Scott was also emphasizing that it depends on what dollar of spending you're talking about. And so, for example, we all, I think, agree on the issue that stimulating demand is really important. And there's discussion around potential scrappage programs for vehicles is one example where there is a multiplier effect that's quite efficient and could achieve some additional objectives vis-a-vis reducing our dependence on oil if we can replace those vehicles on the road with higher fuel efficient vehicles. So there are some spending programs I think that are more productive and more efficient than tax cuts, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that tax cuts, if properly structured, would be kind of subordinated to any given spending program. I think that tax cuts, especially permanent tax cuts, do go directly to assist the consumer to make their choices about how to shore up their balance sheet and how to undertake their own activity, whether it's to increase their saving, to reduce their debt burden, or to simply just buy the goods and services that they need in a very stressed labor market environment. So I hope that answers your question.
Misuse Comic, is there a need for a so-called CARSAR? And if so, what qualifications should that person have, and what should the scope of that person's authority be?
Oh gosh, that's really outside the scope of the panel today. I'm not going to comment directly on whether or not we need a CARSAR or we don't need a CARSAR. We've got some policy experts here in the audience that you might want to talk to after from our company. But that's sort of aside from, I think, what we wanted to talk about today in terms of fiscal stimulus. And there's lots of information circulating out there, pros and cons on that issue. I don't think I have any value to add by commenting directly on that.
Martin Frost up here.
Scott, two unrelated questions. First, isn't the new administration's desire for bipartisanship going to come in direct conflict with your theory as to the distribution between tax cuts and spending? That's the first question, and I think there's something to be gained by getting bipartisan support for this stimulus package, but that would seem to tilt it more on the tax side than you would like. And second, on the question of state fiscal relief, isn't a lot of that money going to go into assisting states with their deficits on Medicaid rather than going into preserving jobs for teachers and policemen and firemen?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's any question that we have to have both taxes and spending. I think everybody is sort of in agreement on that. There will be disagreement about how much. Clearly, there is a difference between a lot of us, and I know Jim shares my view on this, that many of the tax cuts that you can put into businesses are there. There is only one type of business that I know of right now that is really interested in expanding capacity, and that's pawn shops, because there are very few businesses that see that they're going to have the market for greater capacity. So before we start worrying about investments and expanding our industrial base, we need to restore demand, and that means we need to pump it right into the individuals. And I think there is conflict there between what many of us would like to see and what the administration may have to do in order to get enough Republican support to move it. With respect to the Medicaid shortfall and those issues, I mean, this is fungible money. The states have to pay the Medicaid bills, and if they have to start laying off people at universities and laying off state highway patrol and all of that, then that is just another part of the downward spiral. Everybody likes to talk about how pleased they are that states have a requirement that they always have a balanced budget, but in a situation like this, it means that they are part of the problem. They become a pro-cyclical addition to the problems facing the economy, and the more the economy in the state worsens, the more the state contributes to making that economy even worse by its own budget contraction and layoffs and so forth. So we need to break that cycle, and the only way we can do that is to put money into the hands of states. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right about the fungibility, that the changing the FMAP matching rate for Medicaid is a fairly easy and efficient way to increase aid to states. But when you provide that money for Medicaid, that means they don't then have to cut elsewhere to meet the Medicaid demand. So it really does make a difference in their overall operating budget.
Okay.
Dana Chasen, OMB Watch. A question for any member of the panel. To this point in the debate in Congress regarding the stimulus package, insofar as we really know the scope of it, the size of it, the composition of it, et cetera, to what extent are you encouraged or discouraged about the intellectual discipline as reflected in the debate thus far, whether it's comments of the Senate Finance Committee chair or the House Ways and Means chair? How would you evaluate the intellectual discipline vis-a-vis a focus on bang for the buck, stimulative, truly stimulative elements, whether on the spending or on the tax side? And what might be a signal issue that should serve as a lens for us to look through to evaluate the stimulative nature of the bill as it evolves?
I'll take the first cut at it. The first thing I'd want to say is that from what I know of what the Obama team is putting together and thinking about, I'm very impressed with what they're doing. I think they are thinking about the right issues very carefully, both of how do we get the demand out there, what's feasible, how do we put this together? So I think they're doing a job. Doesn't mean at the end of the day I'll agree with everything they do or the exact mixture of taxes and spending, but I think they are approaching this in a very sensible way. I think in the Congress, I think in general, most of the comments are on the right track about what do we do to protect jobs, how do we do it, let's make sure we stimulate the economy now and so on. I think what you need to look at, what I will worry about is as it goes through Congress, you'll start getting ideas for things, particularly tax cuts or for subsidies. I can imagine subsidies on the spending side that are aimed at stimulating certain sectors of the economy or particular companies or something that sound like, oh, this is a way to stimulate jobs. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope you keep the focus on generating increased aggregate demand, getting money in the hands of consumers, states, and so on to make sure that gets spent. And I worry, I think the question that Martin Frost had about when it goes through Congress, the tax side, I worry about that because there certainly are people in Congress, the history of the Republicans on the Senate Finance Committee is they think tax cuts really are the answer to practically everything, and I'm afraid we will get pushes for tax cuts that won't, in fact, help stimulate the economy nearly as much as the alternatives.
I think that the challenge that this situation places in terms of policy development is one of the greatest in my lifetime, and I think it's somewhat akin to the planning that had to go into the fighting of World War II in some ways. I mean, it's just so massive. There are so many. I don't think you can't do this without examining the capacity of almost every federal program and looking at whether there are things that you could do there that would provide a boost, that you could accelerate procurement so that you could take care of some issues now that will allow you to have a smaller deficit in the future. I think the tax challenges in terms of understanding the impact on an economy that's changing this rapidly are tremendous. And one thing you have to remember is there are several thousand people in the federal government who do budgeting. And none of those can be tasked at this point by the incoming administration that has to make these decisions. I mean, they're in one relatively small building over on 6th Street trying to put this together with a very limited number of people, and they won't have access to all of the career people at OMB, all of the people in the agency departmental budget offices for a couple weeks, and so. A lot. It's unfortunate that we're in this transitional period when we really need the kind of much more rigorous policy analysis than we are able to provide. Ellen, do you have any?
Just a couple of comments. I thought your question was absolutely spot on. You need to have a very good, talented approach that is fact-based. It's driven on some key economic policy prescriptions. I think, being a business economist, there's a lot in economics that can be applied very rigorously to the task at hand. I agree with Scott. It's an immense project. And I go thinking back to the Second World War. When Ford's plants were used for different purposes. I mean, we're talking about some very, important efforts that have to be made. Are there going to be mistakes? There will be mistakes, but there's always the ability to make some mid-course corrections. We really need to stimulate all sectors of the economy at this point to put a bottom on this situation, to find the trough and to stabilize. So yes, I think you're absolutely right, but let's do it with the intellect and the talent and the data and the facts that we can bring to bear.
Thank
the comment that you think that housing is a key concern. I see nothing in the stimulus plan being proposed by the Obama administration which addresses that need to stop the downward cycle on housing prices. What would you recommend?
Thank you for that question. I don't have all of the details. I'm not privy to any of the, specifics around what is being planned. So I'm not sure whether or not there's something. You seem to maybe know a little bit more than I do. Maybe Scott has a little more detail around the housing provisions. But we need to design some policies that begin to mitigate the downdraft on foreclosures, because what that does in economic terms is generate this so-called negative externality. You've got the neighbor being affected in the development because there's a few homes, unfortunately, that are going through the foreclosure process, and so then their home is dragged into the vortex. So there are policies that can directly, address that so-called negative externality. Scott, do you want to?
Yeah, I would. There's a story in the paper this morning that Tim Geithner is reviewing this whole TARP plan and how that money is used, and I think that is clearly going to be directed much more closely at the housing sector. There's also a proposal that is being kicked around in the Treasury and on Capitol Hill that would force mortgage rates downward to conform. Right now, even though they've come down quite a bit relative to what a 10-year Treasury note sells for yields, which is between 2 and 2.5%. There's a tremendous spread between unprecedented. It's about 250 basis points difference between a Treasury note and a mortgage. If you could bring that down to the more normal area of about 150, that would have a hugely positive effect on the mortgage crisis. One proposal that I've put forward is that that we use tax cuts, and just to show you I'm not against tax cuts or don't think that there are some business tax cuts that would be useful. I think that that it would be very helpful for the federal government to give a tax break to companies that hold mortgages if they write those mortgages down to the level that the homeowner can continue to afford to pay. I don't think the federal government ought to take the whole hit on it, but I think that they should share in the loss and encourage the loss, encourage companies to recognize that they have mortgages that are not going to work out, and it's much better to come to terms with the homeowner than it is to allow that foreclosure to put more property on the market and further weight down the price of homes. Up here.
The Obama plan appears to be on change.com, and it shows about $25 billion for highways, schools, and energy. Pretty unspecified as to schools and the energy part. And that appears to be the only reference to infrastructure, the plan. Is that enough?
I think there's a big question as to, and I don't know that anybody has an answer to this. Right now, we spend about $40 billion a year in surface transportation. Now, the government doesn't really do that. They give it to the states, and the states sign contracts with private businesses that build these roads. So the question is, how many of those businesses, those heavy building contractors, have equipment that they're not using right now? And that they're probably not using it to 100% of capacity, but they're using it a lot, and they don't keep a lot around that they're not using. So how much can you expand that $40 billion by? I think you could easily expand it by 10%. You could probably expand it by 20%. You start to get to 30, 40%, and you really what you're going to be doing is you're going to be paying a lot more money to contractors to do the same amount of work because you don't have the capacity out there to do it. And I think we need to go through each of these areas and look not just what the capability of the federal government to get the money out, but what is the capability of the private sector to spend money in these areas. And that's just, I think that gives you some sense of how complicated this exercise is. I think 25 billion may be on the high side in terms of how much we could expand those particular things. But you'd have to see more of the proposal and work it out program by program, area by area over here. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I was just wondering, looking forward a few years, my question's about spending restraint. I mean, there's been very little interest in Congress in that in recent years, and now we're really kind of opening the floodgates. And will that make any attempt to impose spending restraint, down the road worse? I mean, yes, right now we need to, find the bottom in this economy and so forth. But going forward, we've got, entitlements, baby boomers. And I also wondered, related to that, will at some point could we be running deficits large enough that we run into the trouble where will people continue buying bonds to finance it? So that's basically my question.
A couple of things. First of all, absolutely right. We're on an unsustainable long-term basis. The center. Our main big interest of the center, the reason we exist, is concern about programs for low and moderate income people. But we also do a lot of work on fiscal responsibility, in part because we believe firmly that if we don't get the long-term deficits under control, at the end of the day, it's going to be programs that we care about that are likely to be savaged. So we just put out a revised revision of estimates we did a year and a half ago in December that confirmed, went along with what Congressional Budget Office, Government Accountability Office, everybody serious who's looked at it says, which is we're on an unsustainable long-term path. The main reason for being on that is in part demographics, retirement of the baby boom, but in fact that's relatively small. The overwhelming problem we face in the long term over the next 40 years is the rising per person cost of health care. And it's not just rising per person cost of providing Medicare and Medicaid, because those costs over the last 30 years have risen at about the same rate as throughout the whole healthcare system. So it's a system-wide problem, and we absolutely have to deal with that. Now, at the same time, we should, of course, this is not to say that there aren't other areas in the budget that we should make changes. We're not big fans of farm subsidy programs. There are other things we cut. But in fact, there is not a general entitlement problem. Entitlements other than Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are growing less rapidly than the economy. So they're actually a shrinking share of the spending relative to the size of the economy. And in general, domestic spending is not. Now, in recent years, what we have seen is big increase in discretionary spending for security purposes, defense, partly the war in Iraq, obviously, but outside of money for the war in Iraq, big increase in defense spending, and for homeland security and for international. For domestic discretionary spending, it has actually, over the last 8 years, declined relative to the size of the economy. Actually, I think in real terms, been about constant. So just first of all, we haven't had a huge increase in spending in recent years, except basically on the defense side, and the continued growth of Medicare and Medicaid. And in the long run, the real threat is healthcare costs and inadequate revenues.
I think this is an important question. I'd like to answer it in a different way. I agree with everything that Jim just said. And in particular, the health thing it's a big problem for government because government is a major payer of health costs. But it's just as big for Ford Motor Company and the private sector. In fact, I don't think there's a more pressing issue in terms of long-term health of the American automobile industry than the out-of-control cost of health care in the United States. But it is, if you want to have a budget that is reasonably in balance and under control, it is very important that you get through this recession with as little difficulty or as little downside as possible, so that you can get the incomes rising and revenues rising in order to do that. I think if I go back, oh, this clicker is my bane again. At the end of World War II, I mean, we went from a public debt that was equal to about 40% of GDP at the beginning of World War II to 110% of GDP by the end of World War II. And even though we were not in balance, we didn't have a balanced budget or a surplus, we had deficits that were smaller than the growth of the economy. And by the 1970s, we'd cut that down to 25% of GDP. In the 80s, it went up because we tried to have a big defense build-up at the same time we had big tax cuts. And it came back down in the 90s. And right now, you can see the United States is toward the end. We were in '07 at 37% of GDP. Now, we're in much better shape than most other industrial countries. And Japan, which is covered up by the computer thing, is 180%. But countries like Germany and Western Europe, most of Western Europe is around 60%. So we have a lot of room to go before we start getting into trouble with our debt, and we ought to be able to turn this economy around and begin shrinking the debt as a percentage of GDP by well before we get into this too far into this recession. Well before we get to 60% of GDP, which is kind of the break line. That's the target for Maastricht, and the European Union is they want to keep debt at less than 60%. I think the importance of fiscal restraint is clear from the present situation. Because of the progress we made in the late 90s and the early part of this decade in reducing debt, we have a lot more flexibility to deal with this recession than we would have otherwise. And you always want to be in that situation. So you want to, in good times, you want to be paying down your debt and strengthening your fiscal condition so that lenders will regard treasuries as the gold currency.
If I could, one more thing on this, which is we tried to make clear in this paper we put out, we talked about the importance of beginning to deal with the long-term problem. Absolutely have to do it. We also tried to point out that doesn't mean we shouldn't take whatever steps are necessary now to make sure the economy is stabilized and stimulated, get things going. And one of the things we did was a calculation in there, and I think people may be a little surprised at this. One of the ways you can measure the long-term problem is the so-called fiscal gap, where you say how much would you have to cut spending or increase revenues on average over the next, in our case, it was 42 years relative to the size of the economy over that time. When we measured it, we calculated about 4.2% is the fiscal gap. We then, just for purpose of understanding what the current downturn means, we took out the amount that we were adding to what CBO had projected the economy looked like last September and what it now looked like was happening because of the slowdown, the loss in revenues, and also money for stimulus. We didn't put in quite as much as now is apparent we likely should have. But when we did it, it only made about 4% difference in that long run. Went from, would have been 4% of GDP fiscal gap if we didn't have this current downturn and stimulus spending. So difference between 4% or 4.2% over that 42 years. And so it's important to realize that while we're talking about massive deficits and debt this year, next year, a couple of years, those do not add hugely to the long-term problem. And that's, in a way, that's bad because that means the long-term problem was so bad to start with that these really big deficits right now don't make as much difference. But the main reason is that they're temporary, that it's this, and it's upfront. And when you're talking about over 42 years, It's the long-term increasing cost of healthcare and so on that is really driving the problem.
In the back, standing up.
Jay Bonstingle, Columbia, Maryland. How do we get out of this mess without incurring a great deal of untoward or unuseful foreign investment? How do we get out of this without the Chinese owning us?
Well, I think the Chinese have about $650 billion in U.S. Treasuries that they own right now, which is about 6% of the total. That is basically driven by Chinese exports and the balance of trade with the United States rather than our fiscal situation. I think what you're going to see is China is going to decline as a bondholder simply because the U.S. economy is going to be so weak that we're not going to be buying exports from China. And I think the Chinese, in order to survive politically, are actually starting to do what we've been trying to encourage them to do for a decade, and that is to base their growth more on their internal expansion rather than as an export growth. So I think that will move us somewhat in the right direction. So I'm less worried about that.
I think at this point the key thing is we make sure that we do what's necessary to prime the pump to get the economy going, and I'm less worried about how we get the money to do that than the fear that we don't do enough and we go through a really prolonged slump and we've got real problems.
Hi, I'm all for an economic stimulus. My husband's been out of work for over a year and I'm only partially employed. But I'm wondering what we can do that's more productive than just giving people money to buy new cars. I can tell you, if you give me money, I'm not going out and buying a new car. The money's going towards education, to retrain my husband out of network news into something that has a future, and into childcare, so people can actually get back to work when those jobs open up. But I don't see anything in any of these packages that address childcare or education.
I can't speak to the child care. I do know that there is a lot of education that is in the package that's being worked on the Hill right now. One of the proposals that I'm concerned about is that it's too much money, simply because I'm not sure that we have the capacity to do it. But there is a proposal that from the administration or the incoming administration that we increase the work incentive WIA program by about 400% above its current level. I really wonder whether the mayors and governors have places that they can go that they can provide that much increased training. If they do, I think it's terrific that we spend it that way. There is also a part of the package that is going to be directed at repairing schools, and we've got a lot of schools that have real serious infrastructure problems. And fortunately, a lot of those don't take heavy equipment or long lead times to fix. There's also some things we can do in terms of student assistance, Pell Grants, so forth, so that people that can't get jobs maybe can improve their work skills, so when the economy comes back, they'll be employed at a higher level.
I think, particularly in the long run, I fully support more money for child care, a whole variety of things, and if some of that can get into the plan, that's all to the good. But in general, it does make a huge difference for all sorts of things if we get money in the hands of people. If we get hands in the money of a state or we get hands in the money of people, they're going to spend it. Some of the ones who are constrained, They say if we give tax breaks to high-income people, the money's going to get saved for a large extent. But if we get money in the hands of people who are struggling to meet day-to-day needs, they're going to spend it for child care. States will spend it to maintain child care that they're providing and so on. So in fact, in the short run, we just want to get the money there, and a lot of it will go into things that we need. In the long run, we need to think about what kind of assistance, federal government assistance, do we need for child care.
Hi, Scott and Jim. I'm Anita Estelle. I have a combined question, if you don't mind. Martin Frost raised a question about the money going to the states, and you responded talking about the police and the teachers. But we've talked a lot about Main Street and the side streets, and that's really the jurisdiction of the mayors. And I know there's a piece of the stimulus that's targeting CDBG money, and I guess the metro economies have to be involved with the overall priming of the pump and the long-term strategy. So I'd like to hear a little bit more how you plan to engage the mayors, and ensure that the funds get directly to the mayors without being filtered out, because the local roads and water systems are in as much decay as the highways. That's one question. Related to the metro economies, there's this notion of changing demographics, and changing demographics being that 50% of our nation will be comprised of Latina and African American and other ethnic groups by the year 2040, just right around the corner. Now, those communities also suffer disproportionately within the educational and employment realm. And so I'm very curious as to how the stimulus will be targeted in these emerging domestic markets to really encourage those communities which have been left behind and who are now being pulled into this category of global competitiveness in a hurry, how we can prime that pump by engaging the minority serving institutions and other institutions that are serving them more directly to make sure that we're ultimately most successful.
Start with the latter first, not so much the serving community, but it's one of the reasons we strongly support, as part of a stimulus, significant increase in extending unemployment insurance, but also modernizing unemployment insurance so that more states make sure that people who have been working on a regular basis part-time, but because they have children to look after or whatever, are only looking for part-time job. In more than 30 states right now, they're not eligible for unemployment insurance. We think they should be. And that particularly, I think, helps the minority communities, because you have a lot of people who, first of all, they get hit by unemployment. It's people, lower wage jobs often that really suffer. And also in many cases you have particularly women with children who are working part-time. So doing what we can to make the unemployment insurance system work, I think, helps. Food stamps, again, many people getting benefits out there. And it doesn't answer your question about how to serve long-term needs, but at least it gets some money into low-income minority communities that are particularly hard hit in a downturn. The second on the states, and as far as getting money to local, I don't know nearly as much about this as people at the center who work. We have a separate state and local policy issue, and it's something they're very concerned about whether local communities do it. But I know there's a huge problem in trying to design, particularly in a relatively short time, a federal program that can get money to local communities in a systematic and fair way, because there's such a difference from state to state about what is local communities. Is it counties, is it cities, is it townships, and different levels of responsibility. That different levels of government have responsibility for different things in different states. And I can't say it's impossible, but I know this is a real challenge whenever the issue comes up about getting money. Is there a way to design it? And I know it's been hard to come up with. So it's something that I think you're absolutely right to be concerned about. Will the money that does go to states get to where it's most needed? But it's difficult to figure out how to design a federal program that does that, particularly when you're doing it in the context of a stimulus bill and you don't have years to try to design it.
Much has been made in the press and elsewhere about healthcare information technology as part of the stimulus package. do y'all comment on what kind of an effect you think that might have?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's potential if, in fact, there are people out there right now who are not, fully employed, and you can put money into that and it gets them employed, then you've helped to stimulate the economy, and I do believe there are long-term benefits from increased healthcare technology. On the other hand, if all you're doing is shifting people from doing one kind of work in technology to another, you get the long-term benefit, presumably still, but you wouldn't get the stimulus. I don't know enough about that area to know which is the case. So there are people who think that, in fact, this will help stimulate, and they may be right. I don't know.
Paul?
Yeah, I heard Senator McConnell on the radio this morning stating the obvious, which is that what unites Republicans from Maine to California is tax relief. I would hope that one of the things that unites progressives is commitment to a progressive income tax. And we've seen an erosion of that over the recent decades. How much should restoration of a progressive income tax be a part of this debate?
Well, first of all, I don't think as a part of this debate we're going to get into the long-term tax, plan. On the other hand, it's certainly progressive should be part of this debate to the extent that there are taxes in here. So, for instance, Obama's plan almost certainly is going to include on a temporary basis some version of his making work pay proposal. And in that, it is a refundable credit. So at least that is one where, while it's hard to know exactly how high up the income scale it will go, maybe up to $200,000, which is not low income. At least it is one that is refundable for people who have wages, and the question is how much and so on. So, and that's important for two reasons. One, just generally, I think tax should be progressive. But second, when you want to stimulate the economy, you definitely want a progressive tax cut, because it's the people that are more cash constrained, lower incomes, that are going to spend the money instead of saving, and that gives you more stimulus. So certainly to that extent, debate about progressivity of taxes should be part of this debate.
I agree. At the back.
What's the answer to people who say, this strategy was tried in Japan, and while maybe they stopped the economy from a free fall, all they got was 10 years of basically no growth. That you really need to somehow to kick the private sector into if you really want to have a full-throated recovery.
Well, I think there's some parallels between what's happened in the United States and Japan. We allowed our housing sector to become grossly overvalued, but not in any way close to what happened in Japan. I mean, we're talking about maybe a 50% overvaluation of housing in the United States, or maybe even 100%. They were radically overvalued, 2 or 3 times that high. So it took a very long time to recover from that, and it was a problem they had with their almost every asset in Japan was grossly overvalued. I would say the other answer to that question is what would have happened to Japan had they not used all the fiscal and monetary stimulation that they did. I think that they could have gone through much of what we went through in the 1930s. I mean, we got to 25% unemployment by 1932, and we didn't get it down until 1940, really, where it was above 20% for 4 or 5 years. I don't think there's no need for any modern economy to go through that anymore, and I think people that are saying, well, we shouldn't do this, simply haven't looked at the massive human suffering that occurred in the 1930s as a result of our not pursuing greater stimulus.
certainly no expert on the Japanese experience, but what I have read about it, and I think it makes sense, is that Japan did do big stimulus, but they tried for a long time to deny that they had the fundamental problem that Scott talked about of the overvaluation of assets and a banking system that just was not at all efficient. And, to some extent, the fact that we're undergoing what we're doing now, where we have seen the prices in housing go down, we've seen this incredible shakeup in the financial system, is an indication that at least, there's been a recognition here that there was a problem, and we haven't tried to prop up housing prices at the levels that they were at a year ago. We haven't tried to tell banks, just keep on, doing what you're doing. Now, we hadn't necessarily dealt with it the best possible way, but we have, in fact, let those things sort of, sort themselves out in a way that I think gives you the hope that once we get the economy going again, we can sustain the growth in a way that Japan for a decade wasn't able to do because they didn't recognize, sort of bite the bullet and deal with the problem early on, and they kept trying to just muddle their way through. And so I think there's hope that we can have a much better situation, a much better outcome here than they had.
Okay, one more question, or are we done? Okay, thank you very much.